Time to start putting shutters back together. This is the first shutter that I took apart, the one that had lacked the exposure value system, light value system. Okay, so here I've got the case, the retainer plate for our diaphragm blades, and the control plate, if you like, that swings the blades inwards or outwards. And these just need to be cleaned. And I'm using Naphtha cigarette lighter fluid. And they just need to be cleaned to remove any traces of oil or grease or dirt or other contaminants. And you can probably see that there's rubbish coming off there on the cotton bud. Now there's a few marks on that moving plate. You can probably see them. They're surface corrosion. Fingerprint there. They're of little consequence. If they're very rough, they can make a difference. You know, the diaphragm blades won't want to move smoothly. This is the face that side. This is the side that faces the inside of the case, and not the blades. See, I'm holding it by the edges. If I was being exceptionally enthusiastic, I might put on finger cots like a watchmaker. But I'm not being exceptionally enthusiastic. Just normal, careful handling. So some of this that's coming off is probably dried out grease. There was probably a little bit of graphite grease floating around. Some of it may have found its way here. I'm just going around that outside edge. That plate's quite clean now. Certainly more surface corrosion visible on that face. That's no problem. The retainer plate. One side's got 5 little indentations in it. They face towards the shutter blades. The flat face faces towards the diaphragm blades. This is the side that faces the diaphragm blades. That's quite clean. This face that faces the shutter blades, I'm just checking that now. Now with your cotton bud, as you're cleaning this, you can feel if there's any roughness there, because the cotton bud, instead of sliding across it, will stick. It'll be rough, you'll feel it, so you'll know that there's something you might need to deal with. And typically what you'd be doing with something like this is using a bit of brasso metal polish or something similar, just to polish those little spots of surface corrosion. There's no need here, that felt fine to me. So those pieces are all clean. The case, let's do the case. So, just putting some naphtha on the cotton bud. So this surface in here is where this plate runs, in that recess, and then further out you can see where the blades will swing out for the shutter. So I'm just wiping the inside of this case, removing any traces of oil and grease. The outside of the case, the same thing. This is where our control lever for the diaphragm blades runs at the back here. So that typically has something to lubricate it. Graphite grease was commonly used. can see there's quite a bit of dirt come off there. So you'll go through a fair number of these while you're working on a shutter, but fortunately they come in packets of hundreds and they're cheap as, so no problem. Be careful of the flash contact in the case there. It's easy to catch that with the cotton bud and bend it, and generally speaking you can push it back into shape, but because of the springiness of it, that can be difficult to get the mechanism plate back in easily. Okay, so those parts I'm quite pleased with the state of those. I'll just pop them to one side. We need to clean the diaphragm blades. So we've got 10 of these, and these are all pretty clean to tell the truth. I'll just lay them out here, then I'll clean them one by one, and we can put them aside for reassembly. So these look quite clean. So I've got a toothpick here that I can use to hold the blade to stop it running away from me while I'm cleaning it. And you need to be quite cautious with these blades. They are thin. It's easy to catch the cotton bud on them while you're cleaning them, and bending the blade. Now, bending the blade is a problem because it's very hard to bend it back and get it nice and flat again. You can pretty much achieve it with a bit of work, but it's much better all round if you don't bend it in the first place. So very gentle with these, cleaning them, both faces, and check around those pivots. They're just riveted into the blade. In severe cases, those pivots can be torn out of the blade. It's not something you commonly see with these shutters, but some shutters that you do get that from time to time, and that occurs when the blades are gummed up with oil and they just stick. Oil will stick flat surfaces together just like glue. So if you get on the camera on a cold morning and it's got old oily blades, they'll be stuck together just like super glue. And if you try and force the diaphragm setting, the aperture setting, something's going to give. Now, more commonly with these shutters, what happens is one of the rivets, the pivot points here, will just be pulled out of the control ring, and you'll have a blade that flaps about. But with some shutters, you're more likely to tear the rivets out, in which case the blade is effectively ruined and you're going to need a replacement. You can sometimes re-rivet them in place, but normally to do that you'd need to create a new rivet. Well, you can see how tiny they are. You'd certainly need a little lathe to do that, and it would be very awkward indeed. You'd probably need a jeweler's stoking set to set the rivets to a decent extent. Alright, so I've got my blades there and they all look good to me. So the diaphragm can now be reassembled. Here I've got the retainer plate sitting on my assembly jig, and my assembly jig consists of a 27mm 1/2 inch square drive socket, a 10mm 1/2 inch square drive socket, and a little piece of wood to hold them together. The retainer plate goes on that way up, the little rivet sticking upwards, and start putting the blades in place. Now here's a blade. That pivot there pointing down goes into one of these larger holes here on the inside rim, like that, and I swing it into place. Rotate my jig, get the next one in position. These blades are nice and flat. They aren't always nice and flat, so sometimes reassembling them can be problematic. The blades get to be something other than nice and flat if the blades have been very oily, and as the aperture setting is changed or attempted to be changed, the blades get stressed up and they tend to bend. Right, that was the easy stuff. Fleck of cotton there, I'll get that off that pivot point. Now I've got to pull back the blades that I put in earlier, swing them outwards so that I can get the next blade positioned. So yeah, you need a steady hand to do this, but like all these things, you get better with practice, and this is something that you're not always going to get right every time you do it first time. I've done a lot of this, so I can actually get them together the first time I attempt it, most of the time. But do not be surprised if you have to make 2 or 3 attempts to get this right. So now I've got to lift these blades up and over the top of the rivets and swing them into position. All this without disturbing any of the blades that are sitting in the plate. You don't need to be lifting those pieces out. So this piece goes on now, and unless I miss my guess, I've got my jig set up so that little rivet is pointing towards me, and on these 10 blade diaphragms I know that the second slot from this piece is where I need to have that lined up pretty much with that rivet. The cutout is here. That cutout's important. Let's see if I can get this on. So I've got to get that plate over the top of those rivets. And you give it a bit of a wiggle to get them all seated. So all those rivets have popped up into their slots. You can see that the cutout is over here, and that's in this brass edge, and this post here we've got 2 slots away from that chrome plate there, that pin. Now the case can go on, and the case only goes on one way. If you look at the back of the case, you'll see that we've got 1, 2, 3 screw holes which will line up with these plates here, and this hole here which is slotted. That slotted hole drops over that pin. I give it a bit of a wriggle, flip it over. Now I'm not dropping that down on the table. I can lift my jig off, or the outside of my jig, swinging it underneath, and it just serves as a handy support for me while I put the screws in. Now we've got 3 little screws that hold this together. They're all identical. Just run them down lightly. You've got to check that the diaphragm moves smoothly before you tighten any screws up, because if one of those little pivots has dropped out of its socket while we've been putting the case over the top, and you tightened up the screws before checking, you could end up damaging something, typically bending one of the blades. It's a bit tricky to see the screws here. The lighting's a bit dim today. Ooh, screw started. Okay, all the screws are started, and I can check this. So I'm looking to make sure that all the rivets are sitting in the plate. I'll flip this over and check that the blades move smoothly. They seem pretty good to me. So that looks like that's fine. There's a little bit of stiffness there. Now we know we've got the blades clean. There's no oil or anything on them. So there's nothing to stick those blades together. It's not as smooth as I'd like. What I'm going to do is get some graphite powder and drop a little bit of graphite powder in here and here, not in on the blades particularly, and just work that backwards and forwards and then blow it all away. Now, the thing about graphite powder is you need to be very, very careful to blow it all away. It's not a problem particularly when you've got something like this which is clean and dry, free of oil. If you've got something that you haven't cleaned and got rid of all the oil, and you put graphite powder on it, it'll stick there in useful clumps on that oil until you turn your back, and then it'll drop onto the inside surface of the lens and cause you grief. I'll find the graphite powder. Well, here I've got this sitting in the little pottle that I normally do this job in, and this is just graphite powder. And you can't read the label because the lighting's bad. There you go. It's sold for lubricating locks and other such things. You can usually find it at the hardware shop. And someone's bound to ask, can't I use my molybdenum powder? Probably. I haven't got any, and I'm not buying any, and I know this works. I'm just working that in. And that's moving very freely, which tells me that any stiffness that was in here was in this layer. Basically it was in here. So now I'm going to take this outside with my rocket blower and blow, cut it out camera, and blow all that graphite powder away. I don't want any of those tiny little sparkles left in there to be seen. Alright, with that to my satisfaction, I can turn my attention to the mechanism plate, which is this piece. Of course we've got our lens tube to go on there, and the blade actuating ring. Now this all needs to be cleaned. You can see there's some shiny stuff around here. That could be graphite, it could be graphite grease, it could be oil. It's hard to tell until you start cleaning. Now be careful of this spring that's on here. Usually it's not worth trying to remove it, it's difficult to get back on. But you don't want to catch your cotton bud on there while you're cleaning it and rip it off, because it'll ping away into the distance and you'll never see it again. Here's our blade actuating ring. Much more sign of grease or something on that ring. That'll all have to be cleaned. And the lens tube here, this blade actuating ring runs around that edge there, and all of that needs to be cleaned. Just as before, using naphtha on a cotton bud, just swab all these surfaces. You can see there's quite a bit of dirt coming off there, well, grease and dust and graphite and all manner of things. This is taking on a fairly uniform silver appearance. Now that will certainly be graphite doing that, and basically it's been spread around as I clean this. That's alright. It'll just be pretty much embedded in that anodised aluminium surface there. Alright, another cotton bud. This is the side that faces the shutter blades, and it needs to be completely free of oil. There's a spot here. It looked oily. You can see a few sort of marks here on the surface. I'm not sure whether that's oil or whether it's just where the metal's been polished. The surface of this has been anodised and dyed black. Anodising creates a very, very hard finish on aluminium. I think it's an aluminium oxide layer that's created really, and that's very, very hard. So it's quite wear resistant. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's pop that to one side. Have a go at this lens tube. I can see that it's quite grey or silvery around the inside edges there. Want all of that clean. The stuff doesn't need to sparkle. It just needs to be clean. And the outside here is quite important. Internal cocking ring runs around that outside surface, and you want that nice and clean. You don't want it gummy at all. Our central lens element actually screws in to here. This is called the lens tube. That looks pretty good. This piece, the blade actuating ring. This shuffles round like this and back again, and as it does, it swings the shutter blades from the open position, the closed position, to the open position, and as it swings back, it closes the blades again. So this has got quite a bit of grease or something on it. I want it all off. One of the reasons you get rid of old grease is over time it tends to dry out. Its lubricating properties tend to evaporate away, and it's very, very good at accumulating dust and grit. So it changes from being something slippery which helps things move smoothly to being a grinding paste and helping things wear away quickly. So you need to remove the old before you put in the new. As usual, I'm sort of handling this by the edges. You could wear rubber gloves if you wanted to, I suppose. There's nice neat ones that the mechanics use. Okay, so that looks okay. Here's our three components of the mechanism plate, and they can be put back together. Get rid of that big tuft of cotton. Let's have a look at this. It's our spring. Swing that round into position. Now, lubrication for the blade actuating ring. There's a couple of ways you can go about doing that. One way is to lubricate the blade actuating ring with graphite powder after it's assembled to the plate. That's what I typically do because I've got graphite powder and it works conveniently. Another way you can do it is with a soft lead pencil and run that lead all around the inside edge and on the lower face like that, in the upper face like this, and basically you're depositing a layer of graphite on there. That works very well. You've got a lot of loose graphite from that and you'll need to blow it away. Right, let's get this together. I'm putting that in under the spring, and this tab here comes back against that post. I'm going to swing that spring around and clip it into position there on that pin. Now we want our lens tube. The lens tube has 3 lobes on it. One of them is chewed off at an angle. That one that's chewed off at an angle goes here next to that pin. That looks good, and we have 3 screws. One of them, as previously mentioned, is slightly longer than its mates, and that one goes on that position there next to that pin. So we get our bracket that holds the main spring, put it on that pin, take the longer of the 3 screws, drop that in there, run that down loosely, and then put the other 2 screws in place. Got fat tweezer syndrome today, it keeps letting go. Now, if we flip that over, you can see the ends of the screws in the mechanism plate here, here and here, and they're all below the surface. If one was sticking out, that would be an indication that we'd put the long screw in the wrong place. So we can lift those 3 screws up. Check that this moves freely. It does. And that is ready for reassembly into the case. But of course, I haven't cleaned the shutter blades yet. So we'd better do that. Now the shutter blades are all the same. And we just need to clean both surfaces of these, again using naphtha and a cotton bud. Now these are flat. In an ideal world, those blades will come out completely clean and free of marks, in which case they are very interchangeable. But in some cases you'll find that there's an obvious shadow on the blades from their mate where the next blade sat over them, in which case we need to pick out which was blade number 1, the first blade to go in, which will have no such shadow because it had no blade overlapping that surface, and that will make no difference to the function of the shutter. It just makes it look a little bit prettier. So I'm cleaning both surfaces of these blades. The blades need to be free from oil. And I know that there was oil around one of the pivot points of these blades. I might have already wiped that away. I'm looking at the state of these blades. Here, there's a mark there around that pivot point. You may strike blades that have serious marks on them or even visible corrosion, in which case you'll want to polish them with, I use Brasso, which is a great metal polish for things like that. I think we're okay here. There's a few little very superficial marks on those blades, but nothing serious, and certainly nothing that will affect the function. So we can assemble the blades to the mechanism plate.